contentious, and we'll have seen some of that, a lot of that over the last year. And councils are being asked to do a lot, and the local leaders having to make some very difficult decisions. So mistakes will be made. What we need from government ministers is to back local action and not sort of criticise any time there's an issue arising in a particular area. We had the notorious Grant Shapps letter to local leaders last year, which was quite upsetting, and not just plainly not helpful. So I think looking over the next few years, we're going to have to reallocate road space. If you think about the pressure from cycling, from bus prioritisation through the national bus strategy, we've got EV charging infrastructure, we've got micro-mobility, e-scooters, with a fixed amount of road space. So it's going to be really difficult to make those decisions locally. And what we need is government to sort of back us and give us a space to make those decisions locally.
Thank you, Kamal. I'm coming to Mark next. How do you think targets should be set, and in what form, be it input, output, outcome, should they take?
Yeah, it's a really good bit. First of all, I should say I just agree with everything that Kamal has just said, and in particular, I mean, I think given that we've got a climate emergency in front of us, the amount of wasted time on bidding that is being done by officers across all these different local authorities competing with each other on what should be a shared agenda is criminal. And I think we definitely need to move beyond that. We need to move to a situation where people do have that consistency of funding over what should really be a active travel RIS settlement, so a 5-year settlement that allows people to properly plan and build this infrastructure. But just add that on to everything that Kamal said, which I completely agree on. The targets. I think the target that has been expressed is that we want 50% of all journeys in towns and cities to be cycled or walked by 2030. And a lot of people heard that, and they fell into two camps really. One was that they thought, wow, that's really, really exciting. Let's work towards that. Other people looked at that and said that's really not going to happen based on where we are now. So to take the London example, London has seen cycle rates increase from about 1.2% all the way to approximately about 2.5%. I think it would take us about 35 to 36 years to get to where we need to be on that trajectory. So the question is, are these targets, are these universal targets, are they helpful? I guess there's that old adage of you reach for the stars, you might make the moon. So there's some benefit to that. But I think really what is worthwhile here are local targets. So building on decent data and things like the propensity for cycling tool. TfL in London have done some really good analysis around the propensity for walking as well, and you can really go down into some level of granularity and come up with realistic local targets that you can then build on. I think these national targets are not particularly useful, and I think if I was a conurbation that had sort of 22% of my trips walked and cycled, thinking I'm going to get 50% in the next few years, I would look at that and be pretty scared at that and probably not even want to engage with that debate. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, but local targets built on local data and local understanding, that is useful and that is valuable. And there has to be a mixture, I suspect, of outcome and output. So outcome is often influenced by things that the councils have no control over. I mean, obviously the pandemic jumps out, but economic growth as well. So output is a useful way of measuring performance as well.
Thank you, Mark, and handing over to Fabian.
Hi, yes, thank you very much indeed, Selene. Kamal, I think this is really one for you. I wondered if you had any ideas what could be done to support transport and highway authorities that may not have a strong record in promoting walking and cycling. What do you think can be done to support them? Yeah,
thank you. Well, I guess that in terms of how government may support such councils, I think first it's to recognise that these councils are starting from a low base, and that they'll actually need time both to assess needs, opportunities, and to develop their strategies. It takes time to develop a strategy and a vision around this agenda, and to start sort of engaging with the different communities. And sort of expressing what you're trying to do and take communities with you. So that needs to be built in. And we saw what happens when you're not afforded that time to do that from last year, that you get a lot of sort of a comeback. They need confidence that the funding will be there and will be there for the long term. And I spoke quite a bit about that. They also need the confidence of their electorate. And officers need to be supported to help make a compelling business case. So, you know, and things like good practice, advice, evidence of what works will help, you know, including with things like, you know, tricky issues such as managing public expectations, are really, you know, sort of vital as well. And I think it's probably worth just recognizing that that actually sometimes in some parts of the country that cycling and walking will always struggle. It might be, you know, compared to other areas, it might be because of the geography or the topography of an area. Those areas are always going to struggle, and so we ought to be looking. Those places ought to be looking at other sustainable modes.
Thank you very much, Kamal. I think my next question really is aimed perhaps at Mark. So, Mark, I wonder if you could give us an idea what you think that local authorities and other bodies that will need significant capacity and skills to spend the funding allocations required to meet the government's targets, or indeed, of course, any new ones. If they lack the capacity or the skills, what can be done to assist them? Because they're going to have to accumulate a lot of skills and capacity very, very quickly if that money is to be spent sensibly, wisely, and effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really crucial question. I mean, I kind of look at the analogy of education here. So in education, you know, if a school requires improvement, it's not as though the centre sort of ignore it and say, well, that's a not very good school, so we're going to ignore that. We send a huge amount of resource in to help that school and support that school and get better, because every child matters, to use that old phrase. Every journey matters, and that's why we need to be in a place where we're helping all these authorities and help support them on this journey. And I think I come back to that point that Kamal made, and I followed up on, is that every authority is competent enough to be able to make great strides on this agenda over the next decade. But they won't be able to do so if they're forever bidding and competing with each other. They need to have consistency of funding. And if they have that, if I'm an authority that's not doing very well, but I know that I have access to X million pounds over the next 5 years that I can spend on this agenda in line with best practice, in line with the guidance that's coming out from government around cycle design, for example, or walking, or general principles for public realm improvement, then they will be able to rise to this challenge. I have genuine faith in the sector. There's huge enthusiasm for this. But when you're forever competing and you never know where your next buck is coming from, the ridiculous situation in London where boroughs didn't know what they had funding for in 10 days' time, let alone a year's time. So we need to get to the point where we have that consistency and everybody will rise to the challenge. And that's where the role of the DFT should be. And it shouldn't be in refereeing all of these competing bids. It should be going out into the field and helping these authorities to deliver really good outcomes. And that is where Active Travel England can push that even further, as really being that critical friend that can help these authorities. There is an issue around the general number of people that are qualified to do this stuff. I mean, it is genuinely quite specialist. And I think there is probably a requirement to look at the skills arrangement there and the amount of funding that's going into skills, and to try and make sure that we get more people in at the right level to support these authorities. And that really means building people like apprenticeships. So Transport Planning Society have led on creating an apprenticeship degree in transport planning. And we're seeing now that's starting to take off, because it takes out a lot of barriers for people entering the profession that might not be able to do so. And we really need to probably supercharge some of that stuff. So we've got a real pipeline of professionals who can grapple with this agenda over the next 10 years.
Selene, can I just come in with a supplementary on that last question, or do we not have time?
If you quit.
Very quickly, Mark, what do you think? Should there be sanctions for those authorities that actually don't take this up, or lack enthusiasm or interest, or actually do it incompetently? You'd say yes or no?
I don't think sanctions are helpful, because what is the outcome of that? So if there's carbon dioxide being emitted in X authority and we go in and sanction them, is that likely to make it better? Probably not. What's likely to make it better is to go in and support them and help them understand and help their electorate and their elected members, and Kamal made that point really clearly, to appreciate why this is an important agenda and what works in this area. for too many of these authorities, they just don't have a really good local example of what this agenda looks like, because they haven't been successful in these funding bids over the years. And you need that standard bearer, that local standard bearer. It's all very well saying, oh, well, this happened in Waltham Forest or this happened here. Well, people in some of these local areas will pay no attention to that, because they don't believe that that applies to their local area. When it happens down the road in the village, the town, the city next door, then that is when it becomes applicable. And that's where we need to get a local example in every single authority that they can point to.
Thanks.
Thanks, David. Over to Baroness Jenkins.
Thank you so much. Just to continue the thread around Active Travel England, I'm not quite sure what the timescale is for the Chief Operating Officer, whether that's been, I think you might be able to update us on that actually. But what do you feel the role should be, and what resources will it need to fulfill the role? I mean, I think I'm right that 425 million's been allocated so far, but you may be able to update us on that and give us your thoughts. Thank you.
Sorry, was that to myself, or I'm happy to have an initial go.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, both of you could do it quickly, that might be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, well, obviously Active Travel England has got a significant role to play, and I know if you're familiar, but on the sort of, there's a parallel body being set up on buses, the Bus Centre of Excellence. So I think that the two should certainly learn from each other and actually, importantly, talk to each other as well, because, you know, we're all talking about road reallocation here of one sort or another. But councils always, you know, need access to good practice and practical tools and templates. And I think critically, the work of Active Travel should be focused on sort of reducing burdens at a local level and helping them to make some really good decisions. So, you know, for example, we're not spending unnecessary money on doing the same procurement or using the same, using different procurement techniques or different templates, etc. That, you know, there should be, you know, anything that Active Travel can do to sort of standardize some of this will be really helpful, and it can help by facilitating learning across councils. Its inspection role, I think, should be as much, if not more, about sort of sharing constructive criticism, acting much more as a sort of critical friend rather than just sort of pure hard-edged sort of inspection. And also, we want Active Travelling, it needs to be a clear signal that it's there for the long term as well, that people can rely on it. And as Mark was saying before, that you start creating a sort of an infrastructure or ecosystem where more people want to come into this field, and we get more and more sort of expertise coming into councils. And as I said before, as well as practitioners, I think it should also consider support for elected members, because they are the ones at the end of the day having to make some really difficult decisions and answerable to their electorate. So any help with things like, you know, around community engagement, developing leadership skills on this, dealing with different viewpoints, etc. It would be really helpful. I mean, we're going to do some of that ourselves at the LGA, but we can really only scratch the surface with the resources that we've got. But I think something like Active Travel England and the resources it will have will be in a better position to do that. We'll be happy to work with it.
Thank you, Mark. Anything?
Yeah, I do think this issue around community engagement is absolutely key, and in some ways it's even more important than some of the practical design and engineering. I mean, shutting a road, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but I can design one of those schemes. But what I can't do is bring the community along with me. I need specialists in community engagement and participation, and importantly, being able to properly understand how you measure community mood on this, because you have statutory consultation, but that barely touches the surface on this stuff sometimes. And being able to cut through the noise is a favourite phrase of the department at the moment, I think is really important. The other really important thing I think that ATE need to do is this interface between land use and planning and transport. So they really need to have some real teeth in that respect, in the same way that Highways England have teeth to actually stop inappropriate development. So where there's an excellent organisation called Transport for New Homes that sort of exposes some of the development developments that we see, I think Ruth, I think this is your phrase, cowpat developments on the edge of town, where you get virtually there's no chance that any of those trips are going to be walked or cycled, because the distances just simply don't really allow for those trips to happen, or the infrastructure's not there. And ATE should be able to call that out and stop those developments from happening in the same way Highways England can, if they feel that it's going to have a negative impact on their road. So that land use development point, I think, is really important, and they need to really play up to that. And I really agree they need to speak to the bus centre of excellence, because you could have a yo-yo where you put a bus lane in one year and take it out, put a cycle lane in, and go back and put a bus lane in.
Thank you, that's very helpful. My second question is, what should the cycling walking investment strategy 2 funding be spent on? So which programmes or initiatives do you feel would provide best bang for buck, as you might say?
Should we do the same again quickly?
Do the same way around, yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. I mean, really, ideally, anything that helps councils to achieve better cycling and walking outcomes for their areas. And obviously, this will vary from place to place. It will depend on their existing performance, where they are on that sort of journey. Another factor, such as the demographic profile, whether they've got a university there or not, how good existing public transport links are, and as I said before, even how hilly or flat the place is. So, it'll vary from place to place. And that, as Mark said, some of the most important action to increase levels of cycling and walking will depend probably on planning policy. Increasing density, reducing parking availability could be policies that are helpful on this as well. Some may require more infrastructure. Others will need to focus on making existing infrastructure safer. And in other areas, it may already be there, but the focus needs to be encouraging on take-up. For example, targeting younger people so that their first choice of travel is by active travel, rather than thinking they ought to be looking to get a driving license, and then obviously they'll want a car then as well. So, I think that ideally it should be councils should have resources to be able to spend on a variety of things, just dependent on local circumstances as always.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I mean, there is this important point about having modally specific funding pots. I mean, I remember when I first arrived in London, I think there was 27 different programs that you had to bid for. And if you wanted to do a sort of integrated corridor scheme, you had to get the bus man, the walking man, the air quality man, the cycling man, everybody to agree. They were all men as well, actually, to agree to do this. And if you didn't have a scheme, and we don't want to go back to that. So having some integration between the modes, I think, is really important. And actually, the LTP, the local transport plan, or the local implementation plan in London, is a really useful document. It's kind of been a little bit downgraded in recent years, but that could be a really important way of making sure that these things are coordinated, and that there are some checks and balances on the quality and of the ambition in the local areas, and that could be a useful mechanism for that. I do think there's definitely a role for revenue schemes, for marketing, for behaviour change, but I do probably think the focus does need to be on environmental change. And I think the letter that went out to authorities about active travel tranche 3 sets it out quite neatly in terms of what interventions should be prioritised. I mean, there's no doubt about that low traffic neighbourhoods do offer a very important input into this debate, and it does appear that the data is very promising there, but they're not a panacea, and they're not going to be appropriate in all locations. And I think that's probably where we need to be a bit careful.
Thank you. I think I'm done now.
Thank you, and I'm handing over to Ruth.
Thank you very much, Selene, and my apologies for being late. I came from another event I was chairing, and then I struggled to get into this meeting. And also, if we haven't done it before, I need to declare that I've known Mark Frost since he was a junior transport policy officer in London Borough of Hounslow many years ago, and for a lot of that time I was a cabinet member, so I have worked with Mark quite a lot in Hounslow. Shall I, so I better start therefore with Kamal. Are there funding models or mechanisms that can give delivery agencies the necessary confidence to act without limiting unacceptably central government's room for manoeuvre?
Yeah, thank you. When it comes to funding, it's not always about the quantum, and the quantum is obviously important, but it's we've touched on it a few times, but it goes back to the point that the most efficient and effective way of securing those long-term outcomes is to provide that longer term certainty of funding. There's a reason why Network Rail and Highways England get a longer term funding envelope, and more recently mayoral combined authority areas as well. So it sort of, you know, it frustrates us councils, other councils, that why treat local infrastructure any differently from that? Why are local roads treated any differently from strategic roads? It's all one big network after all, and there's, you know, the sort of, they're all so interdependent on each other. So we hope that sort of is picked up in the next spending review, and it might not have escaped you that in this current year that we actually saw £400 million drop in highways maintenance funding from last year. That has a significant impact on plans. So councils already have plans in place, and now they can't go ahead with those schemes. And obviously a lot of those schemes would have been helpful in terms of helping with this agenda as well. And I think one of the things the government could do and give much more vocal backing on is helping councils in terms of generating their own income. For example, through you know, things like workplace parking levy, maybe local congestion charging schemes. You know, there's, you know, these things are very, very difficult politically to see through and to deliver. But having government backing on there, and a clear signal saying that actually, you know, it would be great if more councils could do this, and we'd like to help you to bring such schemes forward, then that'd be really, really positive, because those sorts of schemes will both have a direct impact in terms of managing demand in terms of car use, but also bring in vital revenue that you can use to invest and maybe borrow more money to invest in infrastructure, and that doesn't have to come at a cost to the central government or the taxpayers at a national level at least.
So what you're saying, that goes quite a lot wider to devolution of fiscal powers to a greater extent.
I think so, and some of those powers already exist. Workplace parking levy, councils can do that. They need the permission of the Secretary of State. Congestion schemes already exist, but the problem is that it takes money and obviously strong local leadership. But councils aren't going to do it easily without, if they think the government is not going to be supportive of this. So we need government support on this to see these schemes forward.
Thanks very much. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no end of models out there that work really well. I mean, actually, notwithstanding the reduction in highways maintenance funding, the way that is divvied out via formula, via allocation, and it is topped up by the system called self-assessment. So highway authorities fill in a big pro forma that shows that they are spending that money efficiently and well, and as a result, they get a top-up funding on that allocation. And you could do something very similar around active travel. So you give a base level, so everybody's got certainty over what would be like a RIS period, 5-year period, and then for those authorities that are exceeding, they have an opportunity to maybe get some additional funding in, so it gives an incentive to sort of push the boat out. So there's lots of different models out there. I think the key is to trust local authorities to deliver this stuff by giving them the money and giving them the certainty, and just putting the framework in place around the guidance, around the sharing of the best practice, about that critical friend role, and you really will see you know, a significant shift in this agenda if you were to do this. Just bidding every year on year, is just not going to deliver what we need.
Something that's often said about local traffic schemes is this end of year panic to get the money out of the door before the end of the financial year, and things are delayed and then done in a rush, and there often aren't the resources on the ground or adequate skill or whatever. Is that partly an issue at local government level, or is it also an issue in terms of how government gives notice? One of the other earlier questions did address this issue about stop-start government decisions, but is there anything that government can do differently to ensure that more steady, longer-term programme of investment on the ground? I'll start with Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to Kamal's point about flexibility. So, you know, in London boroughs, up until recently, they got a set settlement every year, and that was pretty much guaranteed year on year. And boroughs were able to move things around pretty flexibly within that programme to ensure that they did spend the money that was given to them pretty much each year. And then if a scheme that was coming forward was, for whatever reason, wasn't able to progress, then they were able to move that and put it onto something else that was compliant with that wider framework. So, you know, a cycle scheme hits a problem because there's a statutory utility, they can spend the money on electric vehicle charging points or something along those lines. And I think actually that flexibility is what's key to seeing action within this agenda. I mean, genuinely, I mean, even in your own constituency, Ruth, the cycle lane on Boston Manor Road would never have happened had we had to have done that within 1 year. As you know, it took about 4 years to build that. And we only do that because we had the flexibility to deliver that scheme across several different years. And that just is simply not open to people at the moment under the current system.
Sorry, you say the current system because that's a fairly recent scheme, so it's changed for the worse in not very fairly recently. And sorry if you've already covered that, my apologies. But if there's still time to clarify what you've just said about then and now, what exactly do you mean?
So, I mean, the system in London obviously is very different now. So we're all bidding for our projects, and you know, it's a huge retrograde step, and basically nobody can deliver anything in the current London system, I don't think, with any certainty. Outside of London, you do have a little bit more certainty, but you're still in a position where you're bidding. So if you don't get that bid, or you get the bid that you have to deliver this thing within 18 months, then that rules out a lot of ambitious projects, because most of the projects can't be delivered within that time.
Yeah, and there's too many unambitious projects in terms of cycling and walking with a few 100 yards, and then you hit a junction and you lose the safe space. And
Yes.
If you're on a bike, do you go out in the traffic or annoy the pedestrians? So, yeah. Come on. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
So I was going to say, too many of those schemes are the way they are because of the funding mechanism, not because of the local ambition.
Okay. Anything to add, Kamal?
No, I think Mark's made the point. It's all about the funding certainty and funding flexibility. The more certainty you have, the more you can plan schemes that are really meaningful and can make a big difference, rather than just ending sort of abruptly. We've seen too many of those, I think.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, it looks like we're a bit ahead of time. So luckily, I've been given the big picture question to ask. So the question is, what else do DfT and other government departments need to be doing in order to maximise the impact of CWIS2? So I'll go to Kamal.
Yeah, thank you. Well, ideally, we want the government to be thinking about all the modes of travel and that are available for people, but both sort of now and in the near future, and that the impact that these will have on the propensity of people to cycle and walk. So, you know, as I said before, there is a push to get more people, more bus journeys, and then we've got micromobility e-scooters already in some places. That's likely to become probably quite a permanent mode. Going to have more EV cars on the horizon. So you need to be thinking about what the impact of policies on these other modes will have on people's likelihood of cycling. So if you look at electric vehicles, for example, at the moment they are very expensive to buy, but if you buy one, you know the marginal costs are pretty low. So people are probably more likely to want to use their electric cars, partly because they've invested in them, partly because the marginal cost is low. So is that at the cost of then perhaps getting on the bike in a journey that could have been easily made on a bike or walking? So we need to think about these the impact of policies on different modes on cycling, and you know, and also I guess think about, you know, what is the cost of driving, for example. You know, is it too cheap, for example, that, you know, to drive compared to other modes? And could there be more that government could do to perhaps, instead of this is not necessarily an LGA position because I haven't really discussed it to this depth, but you're subsidising EVs, you know, £3,000, whatever it is, an EV car. But is that where the best subsidy to go? If your aim is to decarbonise transport, is that where the money ought to go? Are there other areas where sort of comparable subsidies should be made?
Thank you, Kamal. Mark.
Yeah, so other things, we've already touched on the important role of planning. So for new developments, we need to make sure those are as sustainable as possible. And there's a lot of concern that the new planning white paper is going to remove a lot of those controls for local authorities, and therefore reduce our ability to be able to influence the sustainability. So for example, you might have a renewal area that's been designated for renewal, but is only really suitable if you could get some really excellent sustainable transport infrastructure in there. But the chronology of how that would be delivered alongside the development is not really specified within the new white paper. And given there's the concept that we're going to remove section 106 as a controlling mechanism, that has some significant implications, I think, for delivery of sustainable new development. So this issue with the NPPF and the new planning white paper, I think, is really key. I'm sure you have some comments on that, Ruth. And I really think actually Kamal's really picked up on this important point about the fact that we need to tackle car ownership. So we don't want to be necessarily anti-car use, because there's lots of trips that make a lot of sense by car, and in fact actually make no sense by almost any other mode. But we need to open up more space for people to make different choices of mode for different trips. And if you've spent all that money on an electric car or even a normal ICE car, the chances are you're going to use that to make the trips that you do. So if you can open up more shared models of car ownership, so car clubs and the like, we think there's a lot of space there to create a bit more opportunity for using cycling and walking as a mode choice. So idea of sort of co-mobility and mobility hubs that's been promoted recently, particularly in Scotland. So I think that's a really important piece. And so that's not about walking and cycling, but it's about driving down car ownership as a way of creating more space for walking and cycling as a mode choice. We think is important.
Can I just, make one more point, and I think it's a positive one, and that the government have introduced part 6 of the Traffic Management Act, and I think that's a potentially really useful tool in managing traffic flow, but also potentially making roads safer as well, because the part 6 of that act, it basically deals with moving traffic offences. And it covers quite a big range of contraventions as well. So London has at the moment most of those powers. London boroughs have most of those powers, but through part 6 of traffic management, which I think they're promising to deliver by end of the year, that will give councils outside London those powers as well. And I think that includes cycle lanes as well. So that will be helpful. And the other policy that we don't quite know where the government is going on this, but they have consulted, and we're likely to see change, is around pavement parking as well. So hopefully councils will have more powers to deal with pavement parking, which of course is a big barrier to certainly walking. And potentially cycling as well. So if we can get good result on pavement parking and we get part 6, there will be 2 important tools, I think.
Thank you very much. Selene, can I just ask one further question? Because
I've got one as well, please.
Oh, okay. I just wanted, we've been covering governance and you're both transport officers and we've been focusing on highway authorities, but is there not something that CWIS could or should say about revenue spend to encourage cycling and coming from other local government and national government departments, for instance, like health? And is there a role for that to be addressed in CWIS2? Kamal.
Yeah, I mean, potentially, yeah, the Department for Health, I mean, it could set out the cost to health and the health service of car dependency, for example, and sort of poor walking and cycling. So I mean, we could look at this in different ways and look at it from the negative costs of particular modes of travel and the impact that has on health. So it's possible.
Selene is going to start frowning at me. So Mark, very briefly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And there's definitely a role for health, and also the Department for Education. I mean, if you remember back in the mid 2000s, there was a really good joint initiative from the DFT and the DFE around school travel, which was a significant problem for schools, caused a lot of stress for teachers, unnecessary stress, and they put in some joint action there. I think that was really welcome, and it was one of the shame that sort of came to an end, because that was an example of an intervention I think that was working really well. And we are seeing health authorities invest in sustainable transport infrastructure like livable neighbourhoods and low traffic neighbourhoods and 20-mile-an-hour zones. So yes, there could be more space for that where there's a good business case for it. The problem, of course, is that the benefits of more active travel don't accrue to the highway authority; they accrue to the health department.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Selene.
Thanks, Ruth. Can I just throw in a quick one, Kamal, particularly to you with your sort of your LGA hat on, that I obviously represent a very rural patch, which presents very different challenges to an urban one, and sort of some of the talk about reducing car journeys is just not feasible when actually it's 20 miles to get to the nearest supermarket. You're not going to be doing it on your bike unless you're very fit indeed. Do you think, looking at the governance perspective on that for rural councils, there's anything different that should be done? Kamal.
I get that, and we did a lot of work on decarbonisation of transport with the University of Leeds last year, and absolutely that was a point we made, that it's all about local context and what is possible, what makes sense. Cars, yes, of course, in a rural context, cars are likely to play much more of a role. So it's all about sort of, you know, what's the three words, sort of avoid, shift, improve, I think. So avoid travel where you can, shift it onto a different mode where possible, and improve what you cannot shift then, or what you cannot avoid. And you know, all the work that we did on sort of different modes and how they can all help in terms of decarbonising transport makes the point that the percentages of what you do in each one has to vary from place to place, and only really local authorities are in the best place to do that and to manage that and to sort of plan for that. And rural context, I mean, there is, you know, we need to look at all the different modes, and perhaps sometimes we can be easily dismiss a particular mode, saying that's not suitable for a rural area. So if you look at something like e-bikes, you know, they perhaps, I think there's some research done by Creds which said that actually they can be used for relatively short-term sort of short distance commutes, you know, that sort of thing. And, you know, so should we be encouraging more use of e-bikes, and perhaps e-scooters will develop, you know, longer ranges. So there could be more things we could do. And of course, public transport and tackling rural isolation will, you know, public transport will have to play a big role in that, particularly in rural areas.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you to Mark and Kamal. And this ends our first panel. So I'm not quite sure how the technology works, but I'm hoping to be able to now welcome Rebecca Diskey and Becca Macy-Chase. Oh, it's fantastic when the technology works well. The second, so thank you so much to our first panel, which is discussing the issue of governance, and moving on to the second panel, which is much around the transition to low carbon. So I'm going to ask Becca and Rebecca just to introduce themselves briefly before handing over to Baroness Jenkins for the first couple of questions. Becca, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. I'm Becca Massey-Chase, and I'm co-deputy head of the Environmental Justice Commission at the think tank IPPR.
Lovely. Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Diskey. I'm a senior researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and I work specifically on just transition.
Fabulous. And for the first questions, over to Baroness Jenkins.
Thank you so much, and welcome both of you. I'd be very interested in your thoughts about how CWIS2 could be positioned within transport policy, particularly that relating to the electrifying of the fleet and to public transport and to road investment. Thank you. I mean, shall we start with Becca's first on my particular picture on the screen? So we just start with you, perhaps.
Very happy, thank you. So I think that sort of taking the issue of electrifying the fleet sort of as the first thing, I think it's crucial that we don't lock in current or increased levels of car dependency, and there's been a bit of an overemphasis on electrification in terms of decarbonisation decarbonisation plans. And the Climate Change Committee shared some data with us that shows that car use could actually increase in the coming years. So decarbonisation policies don't necessarily lead to decreased car use. In fact, the UK government's currently forecasting up to a 51% increase in traffic in England and Wales by 2050, by which time there's expected to be up to 10 million more cars on the road, taking the total to over 40 million, and a path that focuses on electrification of the private car at the expense of other areas. It doesn't feel like the future that we want to see. It also doesn't feel like it's going to lead to those decarbonisation benefits that we're looking for, or the sort of nature benefits that we're looking for. So we know that there's no vehicle that is totally emission free, and also that all vehicles draw on natural resources to be made. And so there's always a sort of implication for nature as well as climate in terms of an emphasis on electrification. And as I said, it's not necessarily the future that people want. And we spoke to communities across the UK as part of the work that we've been doing for the Environmental Justice Commission. And the message from them was very much that electric vehicles are part of the answer, but they're not the whole answer. And we had a really strong emphasis on walking and cycling, and that being something that people felt really strongly was absolutely core to decarbonisation, to transport policy. So fundamentally, the idea being that walking and cycling should be at the sort of top of the hierarchy in transport policy investment, but of course with links to how, longer journeys, so thinking about the intersection between those types of travel options and public transport, for exception. And obviously the bus network is hugely important to lots of vulnerable people, lots of people in rural communities, etc. So clearly a really important part of the wider policy. And there's lots of different areas where investment is needed, but I think fundamentally the sort of short answer is CWIS2 needs to be put really high up in transport policy, and in particular in that relation to electrifying the fleet. That I would suggest there needs to be a real shift in emphasis there.
Can I just pitch in just on non-electric vehicle stuff, because I agree with everything Becca said, and I also have been quite concerned at the overemphasis on electric vehicles, and it speaks a bit to one of the panelists on the last panel who talked about the focus on essentially just swapping like for like, and focusing on increased car ownership, but even beyond the lofty aims of electrifying the fleet, that I think CWIS absolutely needs to be at the top of the hierarchy, but the kind of flip side is that road investment in road transport really needs to be scaled back. So the £27 billion committed to the road network over the next 5 years is really going in the wrong direction. It's obviously going to increase road capacity and therefore increase car ownership and car journeys. And we've already had £15 billion spent on the strategic road network over the last 5 years. So on the one hand, you do need to raise CWIS and public transport spending up, but you also need to do the stuff at the bottom end and scale back on the road transport investment.
Thank you both very much. And what transport targets do you feel, obviously particularly, but not exclusively with respect to walking and cycling, are consistent with the government's, with the net zero goal, but are at the same time, realistic, having just pointed out the increasing the likelihood of car ownership, which was rather a depressing statistic. Should we do it the same order? Becca, you first.
So I think some of this has already been covered by previous speakers around the kind of balance between local targets and national targets, and I do think that there does need to be a sort of set of direction setting at the national level. So whilst I really agree with what Mark and Kamal were saying earlier around things needing to be sort of suitable to the local context, and I really do agree with that, I think there does need to be a sort of set an ambition set at the national level. So I do think we do need walking and cycling targets at that level. And just to sort of follow on from what Rebecca was just saying then, at the moment, I don't think the government would actually disagree that the investment in walking and cycling is not compatible with the targets that they've set around walking and cycling. So the goals will become realistic with the appropriate commensurate investment, and that sort of is the kind of the key thing that will make it realistic. Where whilst there are forecasts around car increase, they're not done deal. It doesn't have to be that way. What the action that we take now can set us on a different path, and that can create the context that makes that possible. In addition to walking and cycling targets, I think there's some other sort of sets of either targets or kind of goals that it would be really helpful for the government to have. So at the moment, we don't have a target for the size of the UK car fleet. So we could be kind of slightly sleepwalking towards a future where we do have more cars, which without that necessarily being intended. So I think a target for that would be really helpful. And similarly, as with Scotland, a target to reduce car use. I don't think we can see walking and cycling in isolation from that. And I think, in terms of public transport accessibility, targets around that would be really appropriate in terms of what's sort of an acceptable service for rural areas in particular. So I think that yes, whilst walking and cycling targets are important, it's that sort of wider context that enables those targets to be met that also needs to be considered.
Yeah, again, I agree with all of that, and I suppose I'd just add that we also need much more ambitious targets on improving rail and bus, and not just expanding the rail and bus networks, but also electrifying them. So at the moment, that the targets that exist feel quite far off, and there are some places that simply walking and cycling is not an option, partly because they're so badly connected by rail. So if you invest in rail and set really ambitious targets for that, you also then improve the infrastructure and the capacity to enable more walking and cycling. So I suppose, yeah, I'd add that, and then I guess some of the targets that exist that aren't helpful or that could be improved, again, around investment in roads and in the sale of new petrol and diesel cars. So there was a lot of fanfare around the 2035 target to phase out sale of new internal combustion engine cars, but we would argue that's too late, and it also has loopholes, which means that some hybrids will be able to be sold at that point. So bringing those forward and making them more stringent will also help the walking and cycling targets become more realistic.
Thank you both very much, and back to Selene. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Over to Fabian.
Thanks very much, Selene. Becca, if people aspire to own and drive a car rather than walking and cycling, how should policy respond, do you think?
Thanks, Fabian. I think that if's really important, because I think there is a distinction to be made between whether it's the car or whether it's the things that the car is able to give you. So when we spoke to citizens across the UK through the citizens' juries that we ran as part of the Environmental Justice Commission, we spoke to, in particular, people in the South Wales valleys and in Thurrock in Essex about transport, although transport did come up in other places. That it did come up in Aberdeenshire and Tees Valley and County Durham as well, which is the four places that we ran these juries. And particularly thinking about the communities in the South Wales valleys, they talked very much about what a car was able to give them. So in terms of independence, in terms of flexibility, but that was in the context of a deficit of other options. And a really strong message that came from these communities, which I think we was actually surprised by the strength of the view that they held, was they did not want to be car dependent, that car dependency felt like a burden, and that they wanted the things that they needed to have a good quality of life to be more accessible to them without needing to own a car. And that was a really important distinction, I think, between owning and driving a vehicle. So whether or not people are aspiring to car ownership, I think is questionable. I think clearly it is the case, but if you break that down by community, by demographic, I think it's a slightly more complex picture as well. But an awful lot of the people that we spoke to said that they wanted to be able to access a car as and when they needed it. They also really wanted to be able to access other options. They wanted to be able to access good public transport. They wanted there to be good work nearby that they were able to access and get to. We spoke to one woman who said she didn't want to drive to work, but she lived in the valleys. she had to take a job that was outside of the valleys because there wasn't sufficient work in the valleys for her to be able to work there. But she had children that she needed to get to school, and it just wasn't possible for her to be able to do that journey in any other way other than with a car. And that was that she felt that was very much a burden for her. So I think there's you know, it's an interesting picture. It's a mixed picture around the desirability, but clearly there isn't a degree to which people do aspire towards cars. And I think there's an interesting role in sort of how we advertise in cars and the kind of effort that's put into making cars feel desirable, and what the right response to that should be. And looking to another climate assembly, the UK Climate Assembly, there was a really strong message from that group that education around these issues is really important. And so meeting maybe some of those messages with different messages coming from different sources might be sort of really important. Because I think when we spoke to the citizens that we spoke with, for some of them, it was the first time they'd thought about this in this particular way, but on the you know, through the experience of deliberating it and talking about it with other people in their community, they arrived at a stronger and kind of different view about what they felt they would want to be doing, but also that it shouldn't be about individual responsibility. They needed the system around them to support them to make those choices. So I think that's, yes, I think there's, I'll stop there.
No, I'm just going to say as a supplementary, so very briefly, apart from much better public transport, which I think everybody wants, is there a future for accessible car sharing schemes and electric two-wheel systems? So whether that's electrically supported bicycles or electric scooters or electric motorcycles indeed, is there a future for those modes of transport, or are they just not practical enough?
No, I think there is a future for those modes, and thinking back to the group in the South Wales Valleys, they were really keen on things like mobility hubs, where you brought together those sorts of transport options in a local train station or a bus station, for example. So, you know, you were able to think about the connection between those smaller journeys and the longer journeys as well. But absolutely, if you break up a journey into its component parts, I think there's very much a role for those different things. And there was, I think, probably fair to say, a few kind of questions and concerns around car sharing, but a lot of interest in it as well, I think. And certainly, that was thinking about sort of people sharing a car to work, and in the COVID times, that feels like a different kind of question. But when we're thinking about things like car sharing, in kind of, you know, setting up schemes where the community owns a car that lots of different people access, for example, that was a much more popular position.
Like Zipcar, for example, in London, which is very, very good. Anyway, can I move on to Rebecca? Because Rebecca, I wanted to ask you, how do you think CWIS2 fits with the anticipated transport decarbonisation plan and, of course, wider climate policy? Does it fit at all?
Yeah, sorry, can I just add quickly on the last point that on the sharper end, you know, you also can do things, you know, to make wanting a car less attractive. So, you know, we do need to make walking and cycling and public transport cheaper, faster, safer, and more convenient than driving a car. And in most places at the moment, that's not the case. So whether that's through the, you know, some of the policies that we've already discussed, but also generous scrappage schemes for cars and supports by bikes and e-bikes. And then as well, really important, community engagement. So as well as that education that Becca talked about, you know, giving the authorities that are implementing these policies the time and the confidence, as was said in the last panel, to really take the time to engage with their communities and build up the confidence that this, you know, this is like a way of life that will be of benefit to them and is not going to kind of just, it's not regressive. So sorry, that's just to quickly add on the last question. And then in terms of the anticipated transport decarbonisation plan and climate policy more generally, I think, again, you know, all I would say is that it should absolutely, you know, be made to fit and made to be essential. I think, you know, the government itself has acknowledged that shifting transport modes to more active modes like walking and cycling is actually one of the most cost-effective ways of decarbonising transport. So absolutely, it should be given a prominent place, and you know, I would say a much more prominent place than is likely. But again, also, you know, that needs to come with huge investment, and it needs to, you can't just have it on its own. It has to come with the concomitant scaling back of investment and encourage, you know, and policy that encourages increased car use and more car journeys. So and also, I think it really needs to be like very well thought out in terms of networks and embedded in a policy to improve and electrify public transport as well.
Thanks.
You probably have more to add on that.
No, that's very helpful. No, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. Selene, over to you.
Thank you very much. How can CWIS2 assist with the delivery of the levelling up agenda? I'll come to Becca first.
Thanks, Selene. So I think when we're thinking about the levelling up agenda, it's also quite it's important to sort of start off by thinking about what do we mean by levelling up. And I think probably there's been a bit too much of a focus in terms of reducing regional inequalities, in terms of focusing on economic performance, so economic productivity, GVA growth, and that sort of those sorts of outcomes have been the focus in terms of levelling up. And obviously those are important, but in terms of rebalancing, I think it's crucial to look at the wider real and kind of tangible differences that you can make to people's lives. And that, yes, there does need to be investment in physical infrastructure, for example, but there also needs to be investment in the people who lives there, so in the health and learning and well-being. And so when we think about CWIS2, when we're thinking about levelling up, I think we need to think about it across the whole range of socio and economic outcomes that come from walking and cycling. So we know that there are huge co-benefits to walking and cycling that aren't just related to decarbonisation, but in terms of quality of life, social connection, health and well-being. I know that everybody in this room is going to be really familiar with what all of those benefits are. So I think when we're thinking about the levelling up agenda, it's about ensuring that those benefits are targeted to the places that most need to see the benefit. I think that would be I know that this is something that Rebecca will speak to really well, so I'll hand over to her on it.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think those are really important points about, what does levelling up not capture in the way it's currently spoken about. I suppose in terms of like the definition that is generally being used at the moment, I think CWIS2 has a real opportunity to raise the agenda up, basically. So I think that the TUC estimated that an investment of about £8 billion in walking and cycling infrastructure could create over 100,000 jobs in the space of 2 years. And if that was targeted in places that have where and those would need to be really good, well-paid, secure, and ideally unionised jobs. If those jobs are on offer in places that have suffered from years of deindustrialization and where often the alternative job is a low paid and precarious one, that could play a really important part in levelling up. And then on top of that, there will always also be more jobs in travel planning and in local authorities, and as cycling becomes a more popular mode of transport, you've also got the jobs in bike shops and mechanics, as well as the potential role that walking and cycling has in regenerating town centres, so making them more pleasant to be in and leading more to more footfall in for shops and cafes. So I know the Levelling Up Fund, for example, has a focus on transport and regeneration, and some towns are using that to apply for funding for things like the cycling infrastructure. I think Hartlepool's recently applied for money to build a cycling bridge. So I think it's really important, and it should be being kind of advertised more as a potential part of the agenda.
Lovely, thank you. And what do you think should be done about the spatially sort of inconsistent performance of transport highway authorities on active travel, Becca?
So I think, firstly, there does need to, and I think Mark spoke to this already, but there does need to be longer term funding to invest in the staff so that they can develop the skills and capacity, as well as the longer term funding for the work that needs to be done. I think there's a role to celebrate the authorities that are doing really well and doing this work quickly, and there's examples of exemplar work that can be really amplified. And it's really important to recognise that there are varying levels of skills and expertise within local authorities, and the Green Alliance have done some really interesting work looking at this. So people do need support in terms of skills or development of skills, as well as the resources, sort of the money resources. And I think then there's a sort of bigger point around the sort of devolution deals that different areas have had, and that the combined authorities powers really vary depending on the local devolution deal. So if you take the sort of progress that somewhere like Greater Manchester Combined Authority has been able to make on walking and cycling. They have a full suite of powers for transport, and they've been able to use that full suite of powers to make really impressive progress. And then if you compare that to somewhere like Tees Valley, they in Tees Valley don't have power over the local roads network, and they don't have established joint working with Highways England, and the progress that they've been able to make has been hampered by that. So I think there does need to be, in terms of thinking about that sort of the difference across the UK, what powers do people have, what funding do they have, and there needs to be a balancing of that, a rebalancing and an increasing, I would say, of those things.
Thank you. Rebecca, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so.
Lovely, thank you both very much. I'm going to hand over to Ruth.
Thanks very much. And thank you for your answers so far. We talk about the 15 or 20-minute city or neighbourhood. Can that be delivered fairly? And if so, how? I'll start with Becca.
So the question that we took to our citizen juries was a question around how can action on climate change and the nature crisis be delivered fairly? And I think that question about fairness, what can the 15-20-minute city be delivered fairly? You know, some of the answers that they were giving on that broader question would be really relevant here. So things like involving people in the decision making that affects them, and ensuring that when you say consultation, it has you really mean consultation, and you're enabling people from all different walks of life who have different schedules, different household responsibilities, home responsibilities, etc., different languages, etc., to be able to participate in those sorts of decisions. Because I think that kind of issue of fairness really so often rests on people not only having a stake in the decision and inputting, but also feeling like they have, and feeling that it is fair, as well as that it is fair. And a range of voices really makes the difference there. So often when we're thinking about transport policy, we're thinking about a particular type of person making a particular type of journey, and the whole range of people's lived experiences aren't fully captured. So I think when we're thinking about that in particular, it's really important to keep going back to the breadth of different lived experiences. And on the sort of specifics of the sort of 15-20-minute city, I think the sort of name and exact distances aren't necessarily the thing that's important. The concept, the driving concept that people need to be able to access the things that they need to live a good life near to them using sustainable modes, is something that everybody that we spoke with through the process that we've gone through the Environmental Justice Commission and the citizen juries, really agreed with, and it was very much felt that there was an absence of it in places, in some of the places in the South Wales valleys, and that was felt to be unfair. But so much of that doesn't come down to transport policy. It comes down to planning, it comes down to digital connectivity and accessibility, etc. So I think it's taking, you need to take quite a broad approach when you think about how do people live well locally, and it isn't just about transport, but transport obviously has a hugely important role to play in that. Oh, Ruth, I'm afraid you're still on mute.
Sorry, thanks, Becca. I think you've got to go quite soon. So if it's all right with you, Rebecca, can I ask Becca that I've got 2 more questions, and then I'll come back to you and you can answer them all, including that last one. So walking is disproportionately a mode of transport for less for low-income people, and of course health inequalities are worse in low-income areas, but also cycling, which once was the main form of transport for working people and working class people in the UK, is now seen as a relatively, is sort of people who can afford a bike and the kit, and it's aspired, people on low incomes don't often aspire to cycling and don't see themselves cycling, notwithstanding the fear of safety and so on. How does that dichotomy point to different strategies for the 2 modes, and what can we do to make cycling what should technically be a healthy and cheap form of transport?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's really interesting to look across not just kind of economic differences, but also other differences in background there as well. And there will be significant differences in terms of, you know, if you're a person of colour, etc., then you may have a different experience and approach towards cycling, and your community may have different views as well. And I think when we're therefore thinking about people who maybe aren't seeing cycling and walking as aspirational, and that thing about it being aspirational as opposed to normal is a kind of interesting one. But I think that there's an awful lot of work around involving people in their communities that's really important. So, you know, there are examples of projects that are being done across the UK, but it's also the charity Sustrans does quite a lot of these sorts of projects where they work at, you know, an individual level. So does the person have the skills, the expertise, the knowledge to be able to do the things, so cycling in this instance, but do they have the motivation? Do they see other people who are like them doing it? Is it something that, you know, is it an affordable option for them? Or, you know, those sorts of things that play into it. And then obviously then there's a kind of wider social picture. There's what kind of images are they seeing in the media of these sorts of things as well. So I think when we're thinking about that kind of wide scale change across all the different types of communities, we need to be thinking about it from a, yes, absolutely, built environment infrastructure perspective, but also from a community sort of wider socio-political context, and then the individual. And we'll need to use different levers for all of those different things. So whether that's going into a community and providing cycle training, but that cycle training is specifically for women from a particular estate, and then they develop a community, they develop the sort of social bonds through doing it, etc. You can really target sort of your interventions to support people to do it in a way that makes them feel most comfortable. So I think those sorts of, and this comes back to the question around ensuring that there's revenue funding as well as capital funding to enable some of these sorts of projects to be able to be delivered. I think it's also really important to think about what barriers there are for people walking. And so often people who are forced to walk because it's the only way that they can get about are also living in neighbourhoods where the roads are really dangerous. That it's not a pleasant and nice experience for them, and that's really not acceptable. That should be prioritised in terms of changes that need to be made.
Yes, I mean, we're going to have a session that includes behaviour change in one of our next sessions. But I think you're absolutely right about the distinction between different projects. And in Hounslow, we've got some great projects for women and Asian women and so on. But you know, how they're going to change behaviour across the piece, I think it is true. But and also we've got that for people who are less mobile and older, and people are now feeling frightened about people on bikes and e-bikes. So there's that challenge there. Anyway, can I just let you answer the last question for this session on decarbonising transport, and how strong is the the reason Selane's had to go because she's got a media gig, so I'm now going to finish chairing this session today. So how strong is the economic argument for decarbonising through active travel? So
I'll keep this as brief as I can, but I feel like there's a long list here, because the argument is strong. I think starting with the costs saved to the NHS. So if you put walking and cycling at the top of the transport hierarchy, it can release huge health benefits. So there's a stat which, if cycling became part of everyday travel in just 7 cities in the UK by 2040, it would equate to over 240 million hours of physical activity. And that would see over 34,000 long-term health conditions averted, saving the NHS over £390 million over that time frame. So there's definitely an economic argument around cost savings to the NHS, not aside from the sort of other way of thinking about the argument, which is, you know, the benefits themselves being of value. I think there's also a really important argument around keeping people moving. So those projections around increasing number of cars on the road that I talked about earlier also see a likely increase in congestion, and that can't be good from an economic activity point of view. That keeping people and businesses moving, reducing congestion, has got to have, you know, there's a strong economic case for that. Then I think there's a case around supporting local businesses and high streets. So shop vacancy rates are 5 times higher on streets with high levels of traffic. And we know that retail turnover in pedestrianised areas is generally outperforming non-pedestrianised areas. And there's lots of studies that also show that traders are generally overestimating the number of people who arrive by car. So there's counters to sort of potential tension on a position there that if you work with people and hear their concerns and meet those concerns, I think can be countered really effectively. So supporting kind of revitalising high streets, I think, is a really important part of the picture. Then kind of coming back to the health idea, there's something around improving business efficiency, so reducing absenteeism as a result of people being healthier and happier. So there's lots of studies that show that actively promoting healthier travel options have reduced absenteeism in the workplace by up to 20%. As Rebecca talked about earlier, there's also the direct job creation. So I won't go into that because Rebecca's already touched on it. But there is also something to be said about leisure and tourism and the support for the cycling industry as well. So I think there's maybe not the sort of focus of our conversation, but there is that sort of that element in terms of promoting active travel, that it does have that benefit to the sort of leisure and tourism industry as well. Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me today. Oh, Ruth, I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Sorry. Many thanks, Becca, and I think you've hope you feel you've got everything in. Great presentation. Thank you for your submission, and I hope that gets you off to your next meeting on time. So
brilliant,
thank you. All the best. Right, okay, Rebecca. So the 15 to 20 minute city or neighbourhood, can it be delivered fairly?
Yeah, to be honest, on all of those last three questions, I don't have a huge amount to add. It was pretty comprehensive. I suppose the one thing I'd say on the 15 to 20 minute neighbourhood is that it has to be much more than just infrastructure. Because I think the risk of doing it unfairly is quite high if you do just stick in bike paths and make it easier for people to walk and cycle without doing the community engagement and understanding like what people want and where and how it would suit them, and also I suppose specifically like there's a real risk that it could just lead to gentrification of that area by making it more pleasant for a different group of people that don't currently kind of exist there. So that's the only thing I'd say on that. I think Becca did cover the point on low income people and walking and cycling really well. I think again it's like really key to just find out what people think themselves and what would help them and what the barriers are. And then just on the last point on the economic argument, I think it is really strong. So obviously it will create jobs as well as providing the economic and very real benefits to health, to air quality, and to the environment. Becca already gave you some stats, but I came across one that was based on Department for Transport commissioned research, which suggested that if you really invested in cycling in cities, so that's the only investment that we're talking about, that alone could save the NHS between £5 and £34 billion. So it depends on how big the investment was. So there are obviously some really persuasive reasons for doing it on that count. The other side is that the cost of not doing it is absolutely massive. If we accept that decarbonising transport is really, really central to our decarbonisation agenda, as we do, and if we accept that within that shifting people to active travel is a really, really important and cost-effective way of decarbonising transport, which we do, we have to then suggest that we have to then deduce that not doing that will slow us down in our targets and make the enormous costs of intensifying climate change much larger and much closer. So I think it's really important with any talking about decarbonisation, really on any kind of policy level, to talk about the costs of not doing it, which are enormous, and you only have to look at the costs to the cities in Canada and elsewhere in North America at the moment of the really very real climate impacts that are now more and more regular, and that are going to absolutely be a part of our future.
I mean, a lot of the discussion around decarbonising active travel and encouraging active travel is sort of around the kind of very vaguely around the concept of levelling up. but is there an argument for levelling down I mean, we've got the ULEZ coming in straight across the middle, the barrier, the boundary of the ULEZ coming across the middle, across my constituency, and a lot of people's travel routes, and of course that's getting a lot of pushback. But you know, should we be much stronger on levelling down if we're talking about decarbonising transport, and if so, how easy or possible is that?
Well, if by levelling down we mean making it harder for people to drive, then yes, I do think we need to be going stronger and quicker, but that isn't, you can't do that and not do the other stuff that makes it, you know. So at the moment, I totally understand, you know, your constituents and many others around the outskirts of London who are suddenly being affected, completely can understand, you know, that pushback. And you saw, you know, the famous example in France with the Gilets jaunes movement, you know, where fuel duty was increased and the impact was felt immediately by ordinary people, rather than you know, the people who are really responsible, and the activities that are really most responsible for carbon emissions. So you have to have a very, very, very deep community engagement and consultation process. You have to explain why you're doing it. I think you have to have the education as well, but you do also have to have the alternative modes of transport. So you have to have really good transport that works and that's available and that's cheap and affordable. And you have to, I think, you know, car sharing schemes at the outskirts of cities are a really good idea. That doesn't really get past the ULEZ, except, you know, ideally they'd be electric in future. And absolutely have to have, you know, safe, accessible and affordable cycling and walking infrastructure to make it, you know, to make it a really genuine alternative. And I think at the moment it just isn't, and so, you know, people have kind of perfectly legitimized in saying, you know, how else am I going to get to work? I can't get on a bike and go down green lanes, you know, for 5 miles because it's absolutely terrifying. So you do, it's hard, I think, you know, but you do need to do all these things at the same time. And I suppose one of the things that's really important that was spoken about in the first panel is investment is so key, and making sure that that local authorities aren't competing for investment is really important in that, because it shouldn't be a finite resource. It should be absolutely across the board to make sure it's possible everywhere.
Excellent, thank you. That's really interesting. And we've now come to the end of our questions, unless anybody's waves at me. Fabian is. You've got 2 panelists who are still here by the looks of it, Kamal and Rebecca. So, okay, Fabian.
Just very, very briefly, and it can be answered very briefly. Do the panel think, or does Rebecca think, because this is the second panel, that all our discussions and plans and examples are too London-centric? And I say this as a Member of Parliament here in Leeds, but it seems to me that there isn't enough regional policy. London is very well served. It needs to be better, and it is getting better, but there's an awful lot more to do outside London.
Short answer, yes, absolutely. You can probably tell that I'm in London by my green lanes example, for which apologies. And as a cyclist in London, I can tell you it doesn't definitely need to get a lot better here, but I hear you. And I think one of the places we work with NEF on our Just Transition programme is Yorkshire and the Humber. And absolutely that's a place, as a region, obviously very mixed, but where this needs to be a much bigger issue and get lots more policy support and investment for it. So I think, yes, you're probably right, and part of that is the devolution of powers, and I know several metro mayors are doing some really good stuff on this, but hopefully we'll move further in that direction.
I hope so, because at the moment you can cycle around London, generally speaking, without drivers trying to kill you, especially with the segregated cycling. I know you might dispute that, but you know, I cycle around both. But if you cycle around Leeds, I'll tell you, it's not just the topography that's difficult, more difficult than London, but the drivers actually aim for you. It's really extraordinary and appalling. We need a change of culture. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, my late sister had thought that there was definitely, in cities with higher cycling rates, there was a better driver behaviour, and where cyclists are rarer, driver behaviour is worse. Now that's anecdotal evidence, but I don't know if there's some statistics to back that up. And because Bristol is in, you know, you would think that's a really bad place to cycle because it's so hilly until e-bikes came along, but actually is a very high cycling culture. So topography in itself is not an answer. I also think in terms of walking, you know, seeing the decimation of bus services, particularly in outer areas and evenings and weekends, has forced people who can't really afford it to buy a car. And once you, as has already been said, once you buy a car, you're going to use that for your journeys rather than think about cycling. And, you know, you're not like, you know, if you've already struggling to pay the cost of running a car, to have a bike, go out and buy bikes as well. And, you know, I mean, I went to a presentation earlier this week about the shocking level of inequalities in all sorts of ways between London and most of the rest of England, Britain, apart from Edinburgh and Bristol. Notwithstanding, obviously, we have pockets of inequality in all sorts of senses in London as well. But yeah, and transport is just one of those elements.
Yeah, certainly my experience, Ruth, that cycling density in any urban area leads to generally more care between cyclists and drivers and cyclists. Yeah, yeah. And as MPs, we've got a new challenge of the behaviour between pedestrians and certain people on bikes and on e-scooters. But anyway, that's for another day. For another day. Right. Okay. I think I'm done from chairing the session, and obviously I'd like to massively thank all our panelists, all but one who've gone now, and Adam and Tom especially, who's done all the research and background for this this inquiry. Thank you so much. Tom or Adam, is there any housekeeping that we need to finish? Because I think everybody, including Anne and I have gone.
No, just to say our next session is next Friday at 10 o'clock.
Lovely. Okay.
Just to echo my thanks to the panelists for really excellent and really rich testimony.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll see some of you next week. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.